All right, still plenty of headlines I want to get you across tonight. My panel bringing them in now. Sky News contributor, forward Howard Government Minister Gary Hargreaves, and LNP MP, former Resources Minister Keith Pitt. Well, gents, welcome on a Monday, as always.
Peter.
Gary, I'll start with you. Big Super. I wrote about this in The Australian last week, tried to unmask what's going on with the unions and Labor controlling our money. Big Super want our money. They're pushing pretty hard. Australian Super, one of the funds, is seeking permission from the Treasury Department to set up an account for life, they call it, which would effectively merge the accumulation and retirement accounts of Australians. Now, many of these super funds, as you know, are dominated by the unions. They're run by a vast coterie of former Labor politicians. This is a power grab, isn't it?
Absolutely, Peter, and it's proof that they don't trust you with your money, or any of us with our money. They're saying that if you've got own less, you'll be happier. It's the World Economic Forum. It's this all international lefty socialist approach to all of this. They don't want you to buy a house with money you might have in your superannuation, but they'll take your money and buy a house for somebody else. I mean, these are the sorts of things that are going on right now. I think that this would make the Politburo in Beijing blush. Cradle to grave administration of everything you do. You go to work and you hand over your money, and 12% of the wage that your boss pays now goes to these union-controlled super. And if you don't join a union, well, it doesn't matter because they've got your money anyway. And so there's so many things are wrong here. It is a big power grab, and it's all about financing their control, their change of what Australia currently is, and making, frankly, things a lot worse.
Well, Keith's right there. CBUS, one of the big funds, has put $500 million into welfare housing. CBUS, of course, is the CFMEU's super fund of choice, but they won't let you put your money into housing. Just on the same vein here, Keith, the number of apprentices and trainees in the first year of the Albanese government, that's fallen by more than 50,000, despite their fee-free TAFE program. Now, this says to me we're just importing more and more people and we're not training our own kids.
Peter, the Albanese government has been screaming skills shortages, they've been screaming housing shortages, and those things are all true for the last 12 months. And now we find we've lost 50,000 apprentices. There were record trade apprentice numbers under our government, under the coalition government, and the majority of them will be in the construction field. This is 50,000 that potentially help you build those houses, that help you address that skills shortage, and they've been lost. And instead, as you've pointed out, some 500,000 new immigrants into the country who simply don't have housing to be put into, jobs to go to, but it's good for Anthony Albanese's Labor vote. So as a former tradesperson, Peter, I find this appalling. We could have had these kids almost turned out in another 18 months.
It's shocking. What about this news too, Gary? The Commonwealth Auditor General says they're launching a probe into the Albanese government's $2.2 billion spend in the Victorian suburban rail loop. Very controversial project. A lot of calls for it to be scrapped. Now, if the Auditor General's looking at it, that's a real worry.
Well, of course it is, but this seems like a promise that the Prime Minister made when he didn't think he was going to win the election. So he's suddenly got to be accountable for his promise. And, you know, it's all tied in together. You've got the superannuation funds who are changing the way our electricity is generated, changing the way we build houses. You've got the union movement saying that you can't import labour with skills into this country unless they join the union. You just know, Peter, on all these fronts, there's so many things that are wrong. And then the Prime Minister makes this sort of good on your back slapping mate kind of contribution at the last federal election, and now the Auditor General saying, well, hang on a second, this has got dodgy written all over it. So, you know, we had the same problem here in Queensland with the Cross River Rail project, which has no end in sight and no likelihood that the real cost of it's ever going to be known. Any other infrastructure Australia said, we're not going to fund it. So this is all about boondoggles and all sorts of money laundering, frankly, for the union movement. Money out of the taxpayers' pocket through the unions, safety officers galore, hardly anybody on the tools, and you can't import people with skills. So everywhere you look, Peter, Suburban Loop is just another example of this complete rorting of Australia as we know it.
And I might add, it's a rail loop we do not need. And at the same time, we've got all these road projects of roads we actually use that are going begging, that haven't got the money, not just in Victoria, right around the country. Researchers, Keith, Deakin University, they say there's nearly $1 billion in government grants being handed out right now, nearly $1 billion, no scrutiny, almost no strings attached. I mean, this is pork barrelling writ large.
Oh, Peter, as a former minister in the previous government, I signed plenty of grants, I've got to tell you, to the Murray-Darling. And there were occasions where I had a different view, as did my staff, to what was put forward by the public service, and for very good reason. If you look at some of these things, I remember there was a cap on administration of 10%, and at a $100,000 project, as an example, you'd find admin at 10% and project management at 40%. Now, that sounds the same to me, 50 grand out of the price of the project. It wasn't value for money. So there was quite a lot of that getting around. But we do need to make sure that the taxpayer gets their value. But I've got to tell you, I oppose this idea that the minister is powerless, that the minister has no right to make a decision. We are elected, we're in government to be the government of the day, and we take the responsibility. There are very clear guidelines that have to be met. But the idea that the country is run entirely by the public service and the minister has no say, well, I just don't agree with it.
It's called doxing, Gary, and you'll explain to viewers what that actually means. But in this case, over the weekend, we find a whole bunch of Jewish Australians, particularly in suburbs of Melbourne, we'll call them progressive suburbs, left-leaning suburbs, have had their businesses, vandalised out the front. They've been named and shamed on social media for no other reason than they're Jewish, and they're leaving their homes, their suburbs, their businesses, moving to other parts of Melbourne where they feel a little bit more safe. Now, this is the sort of stuff we saw in 35, 36, 1937, 39, Europe. I mean, this is appalling.
Shame.
Well, of course it is. And Peter, the problem is this is what's happening in this country. We've got the left internationally telling us how we can't have our own money. We've got to contribute it to the union movement. The union movement are telling us we can't bring people with trade skills to this country because we've just simply got to suffer. We've got the Chinese government owning a whole bunch of our water resources, a whole lot of our food resources, and now they're trying to give us prefabricated buildings for housing. That's the three things in Maslow's hierarchy of need. We're trying to split apart our society based on race and culture and stuff. And the Prime Minister's showing no leadership when it comes to bringing people together. He's all about creating separate tribes and having gatekeepers at the front of each of those tribes. This is a very, very dangerous time we find ourselves in. The Jewish community are always the canary in the coal mine when it comes to community relations. If they're suffering, who's next is my view. Who is next? And I think all Australians of all backgrounds, all beliefs should be gravely concerned about the lack of leadership from the bloke who's living in two lots of public housing, one in Canberra, one in Sydney. He's called the Prime Minister.
And I might add too, you've got a whole lot of Labor left MPs, Muslim leaders. They want the resumption of that money being paid to the Palestinian Authority, taxpayers' money. I hope we don't buckle on that. Keith, what's the story with these solar farms? They get built. They're only just now being connected to the grid, but they're not running at full capacity. What's going on?
Peter, I've got to tell you, they never run at full capacity apart from a couple of hours a day. In fact, the story at 25%, that's what they do on average. If you want to average 1,000 megawatts, well, you've got to build 5,000 to do that. And sometimes you'll get 5,000 and during the night, guess what? You'll get none. So you've got to build something else entirely. This is the fundamental problem with intermittent wind and solar. If it works for you as a hybrid, great, fantastic. But the idea you can run the Australian economy on something that turns itself off when it feels like it or a cloud comes over the top, I think that's dangerous for our country. It's dangerous for the economy. And you've got to cover the entire country in transmission lines. It is incredibly expensive, and even the Northern Territory, it's a big place, they're a long way apart, and they still won't do what's necessary because physics, engineering, economics are the things that we should be making decisions on. And the first thing we should make a decision on, Peter, is does it work? And if it doesn't work, we shouldn't install it.
Exactly.
All right, you've just proved the point why we need real people in the parliament. Given your background as an electrical engineer, you've brought all that experience to the fore. Thank you for the education. I'll see you next week.